Hello bawb a chroeso nôl. Hello everyone and welcome back. So we're coming back to our last panel now, in panel diwethaf ar currency, on the topic of currency. Y siaradwyr yw, the speakers are Mark Hooper, Tegid Roberts, Justin Peter-Lilly and Ben Ark. And we're going to have a look at what role does currency have with us achieving our goals. And it's hosted by the delightful Elin Hywel. Shwd I ti cariad?
Dwi'n iawn, diolch yn fawr, ydych chi?
Mae'n neis I dy weld I.
Dwi'n teimlo'n under-prepared, sgynna'n fflag na dim byd.
Wel, ti'n ma, mae'n rhaid i gael fflag ablod yn.
O ia, ablod da.
A'r mwclis, so mae'r mwclis yn gweud Welsh hot. Turning that stuff upside down. Right, so I'll let you guys crack on if you to introduce the panel and I'll see you in a bit.
Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch I ti.
Hello bawb, hi everyone. So, croeso yma heddiw yma. Da ni mynd I fod yn siarad efo Ben, Mark, Tegid a Justin heddiw yma. A gobeithio fydd pedwar yma cyn bo hir. Felly nhw'n troi 2 funud iddyn nhw gael roed screens ymlaen. A wedyn, nhw'n I ddechrau. So, everyone welcome. We're going to be speaking to Ben, Justin, Mark and Tegid today about sovereign currency. I'm just going to give the other two a couple of minutes just to put their screens on and join us, and then we'll get on with the conversation. Hello, croeso pawb, welcome everyone. Okay, so to begin with, welcome, and I'm going to go around everyone on the panel first, individually, just so you can introduce yourselves and why you're here today and why this is important to you. So I'll start with Ben, because you're next to me on the screen.
Yeah, hi. I'm Ben Ark. I'm a computer scientist, researcher and developer researching digital currencies. And I've been thinking for a while what a digital currency would look like in Wales and how it could benefit Wales and create social justice. So I'm going to talk more technically on that, how it could be created, what it might look like, and how Wales' economy could benefit from it.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm really looking forward to hearing about that, actually. It's very interesting. Mark, you're next.
Thanks, Elin. Hello, everybody. I'm really looking forward to this piece, mainly because it links to what we were talking about before. So in my view, if we were really serious about tackling issues of poverty and inequality and also the climate crisis, then we need to have all the powers with us, really. So I think this is critical. I didn't used to think it was critical, so I've come to this conclusion, and I think there's a lot of work that needs to start now, and I think politically this is an important debate that we need to have in its fullest sense.
Thank you. Justin. Justin, you're on mute. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Justin. I've worked with organisations like Positive Money UK for the last few years. Their main role was to educate people about the way that money is created, raising awareness about the debt-based monetary system. So I've been campaigning for the last 10 years, it seems like now, for public banking, community currencies, and monetary reform at the government level. So it was great to hear Donald and Mark and other people talk about the issue of debt-based money. And I'd like to talk about some of the alternatives that are available to us.
Fantastic, thank you. Tegid.
Prynawn da, I'm Tegid Roberts, and my interest in in currencies has flipped quite dramatically in the last couple of years. So initially I was fairly happy with the way the Bank of England was doing things, and then 2008 showed that they could quantitative ease for the banking sector, but they weren't interested in quantitative easing for the general public. So I'm a proponent of universal basic income and quantitative easing and central banking, and a healthy and well-run treasury allows you to do all sorts of things that the current Bank of England and UK Treasury are not interested in doing. So that's where I come from.
Oh, thank you, Will. That's a fantastic mix, and I'm excited this conversation is going to be really interesting, I think. But my first question is just for those of us, including myself, who might want to understand more about what exactly is currency. What does that mean? When you say currency, what does that mean? Would anyone like to go first? Mark, maybe?
So currency makes the world go round, essentially. It's a means of being able to transfer what I've got and be able to use it to be able to buy other things that other people have got. But I think there's a bigger question at play, that really it's a construct that's been made to fit a system, so that the money system that we're all using at the moment essentially perpetuates the way that everything works. Now, we've just listened to 2 hours of, I think, quite amazing content of how things don't work. And a lot of that, and I think Donald's points went, it crystallized everything when he said, the reason this thing doesn't work is because we're having to use the system in the way that it operates. So I think I think we all understand that we need, the ability to be able to go and to get things that we need to live, and to be able to essentially use currency in that regard. But I think there's a much more important question about, what's it all for? It sounds very, very, ethereal and a bit academic, but I don't think it is. I think this is about us addressing concerns that we've got further down the line. I think Justin as well, probably given his experience of the education part of this as well, will probably be able to talk how people actually get through understanding what money is as well.
Maybe Justin, what would you say is the easiest way to explain to someone the relevance of currency and money to their daily lives? Why does it matter, other than the obvious? We need to buy stuff, so we need something in our pockets. But otherwise, why is it important?
So currency and money are interchangeable with each other, and they're basically a claim on wealth. They're not wealth themselves. So when we have the system like we do, where the Bank of England is not actually in charge of creating the money, that power lies with private banks. When they make loans, that is new money being created. So that accounts for 97% of money in the system. 3% is cash and coins. Okay, so if we have a situation where money is being printed for quantitative easing, for whatever the government wants it to be for, or if we have, like we did leading up to the financial crisis, there was a large increase in the money being created for mortgages. So this was one of the reasons that led to not only the rise in house prices up to that point, but it also caused the instability, led to a lot of the subprime mortgages and the eventual collapse. So if too much money is being created in this way, it can cause inflation, because you have too much money chasing too few goods. So the ideal situation is money being created where it actually leads to an increase in productivity. Okay, so that's the important point. It's not necessarily always about who creates the money, it's how that money is used. Is it going to lead to productive industry, or does it get lost into the financial sector, for example? which doesn't really contribute to the productivity of Wales.
Ben, can you tell me how does cryptocurrency fit into that then?
Yeah, so just a note on currency, I suppose they could roughly fall into two categories. You have like a hard currency or soft currency, and something like a gold would be a hard currency, or Bitcoin, where you can, it has like a limited supply, a limited cap, whereas a soft currency is something you can increase the supply of, through central banks increasing or decreasing interest rates to make more banks loan money or banks loan less money out into the system. So it's all a case of just trying to fiddle the interest rate to try and create stability. But I agree completely that because control is somewhat centralized, it tends to bend towards the interest of, the neoliberals, the extremely wealthy. And bailing bankers out of financial crisis. But there are many who argue, and I think it's very valid, that capitalism itself is inherently unstable. So you do have these boom bust cycles, and being equipped with a tool to buffer out the bust, so there's less poverty, that there's less economic collapse, and is very important and useful. But then if you have a soft currency, you need it to be something which can't be corrupted. So that's kind of been somewhat my area of interest when it comes to Wales developing their own currency. Should it be a hard currency? Should it be a soft currency? How can it be decentralized in such a way that it's less corruptible? But then how can it also have those functions which we might need in a crisis, or if we want to create some sort of fiscal stimulus to increase productivity and aggregate demand. So that's something which I've been looking at. Most of my work primarily has been based upon Bitcoin and the Lightning Network, which is a super fast payments network which sits on top of Bitcoin as a protocol. And Donald earlier, he mentioned El Salvador when he was talking, and how Bitcoin is now being made a legal tender. So a lot of our software is now being used out there, and you're seeing this real sort of socially scalable use of the technology. I saw a great video of someone paying for their electricity bill, and it was just a scan of a QR code on a letter, and then boom, they paid their electricity bill. Whereas before, he would have to sit for 3 hours on a bus and go somewhere and pay, and then 3 hours on the way back as well, because he was indeed one of those 70% of the unbanked in El Salvador. So that's infrastructure and financial system can kind of go from zero to hero very quickly by adopting this stack of software in fintech. And that's something which I'm very interested in Wales doing, because actually, that guy paying for his electricity bill in El Salvador and is hut in El Salvador is now leagues beyond what me having to sit on the phone and go through some messaging board or whatever to try and get to pay my electricity bill. So that's primarily been my interest, is how these rails and protocols can bootstrap and make huge efficiency savings in an economy and in productivity in general. And so that's primarily where my research has been.
I'm on mute, so that's going to happen several times because I'm useless with my mute button. So yeah, I apologize in advance. Tegid, we've heard there about like soft currency and hard currency. We've heard about decentralizing control and a lot of other things that actually sound really quite exciting, and shifting power to people in Wales. But can you tell me a little bit more about what are our actual options? If we were an independent nation, what would our options be if we came to choose currency?
So currently we are using the pound sterling, which is governed entirely by the Bank of England. Note the name, Bank of England. It's not the Bank of the UK. They never bothered to change the name, which was established around 500 years ago. So all monetary policy is decided between the UK Treasury and the Bank of England. So if Wales was an independent country, like Ireland became in 1922, it could establish its own currency, like Ireland did, and have a monetary policy dedicated to Wales and Wales only. And I think that's the exciting bit. So we could have our own regulator, banking regulator. We could have stronger controls over the amount of lending that banks are able to do. So at the moment, the ratios between the assets of a bank and how much lending are within reason, fairly unlimited, and which in many ways caused a lot of problems in 2008. So we were getting up to the levels of 30 to 40 times assets for lending, and that then causes huge amounts of instability. So Wales could have a monetary policy where it decided not to do that, to have a more rigorous system. But our choices could be that, in my opinion, we should set up our own currency, a pint or whatever you want to call it, rather than adopt a currency which is local to us. We could, if we rejoined the European Union, adopt the euro, but my personal opinion is that if we had a sovereign currency, that would be more powerful for us. In order to get over the relatively short-term turbulence that would be there if we did set up our own currency, we could peg it to the pound for a period of time. That is exactly what Ireland did. Ireland pegged its pint to the pound for 50 years. We may decide not to do it for 50 years. We may decide to do it for 15 to 20 years. Depends how quickly we'll be able to stabilise our economy. But in my opinion, a sovereign currency in Wales would be ideal. Iceland has one, and they have a population roughly the size of Cardiff. So Iceland has its own currency, 450,000 people. There's no reason why Wales, with 3.2 million people, can't have its own currency, in my opinion, especially with modern day digital systems. And so we wouldn't be, we would be effectively starting from scratch. We wouldn't be, we wouldn't be on the gold standard came to an end in 1971. UK came off the gold standard in, I think it was 1934. So, we would be starting from scratch, and we could have an entirely new digital system. I do think that if we are going to have our own sovereign country, we should be starting this work now. We should be planning now. I think waiting 4 or 5 years from now would be a huge mistake. So I would advocate a lot of graft being done on this now. And today's event obviously is a way of kicking that off.
I agree completely that there's no reason why it shouldn't be started now, and also it couldn't be a tool of liberation. It's a sovereign currency. Way I envisioned it as being sort of federated among signatories. It could exist on a small scale and grow organically as the independence movement grows, and if people want to adopt it and use it because they see value in using a sovereign currency or something which they can culturally associate as sovereign, then great, and then we'll see it roll out, rather than it be suddenly we become independent and then we switch to this new monetary paradigm. It seems to make a lot more sense to roll it out and let it grow organically with the independence movement.
This sounds really great, and it's really interesting. But I'm hearing a lot of terms thrown at us here in this conversation, and this is often something that stops us as people on the street being able to understand what does this mean to me. And I can't help but be worried when I hear things like your term short-term turbulence and stuff like this. What would this mean to us in our public life, services, the health service, that kind of thing? If we were to change currency, what would that mean for us?
That part of it is a little bit theoretical at the moment, because one of the biggest issues that we would have with Welsh independence is we would have to take our portion of the national debt. The national debt of the UK is currently 2 trillion, roundabout. So as about 3% of 5% of the UK population, that would work out as about 87 billion, Wales's share of the national debt. So although that sounds quite frightening, it wouldn't be like the be-all and end-all. That could be a manageable amount that we sort of look to pay off over time. But this would mean we wouldn't be able to run at a deficit. If we were running at a deficit in Wales, that debt burden would only increase. So we would need to be very fiscally responsible. It could, in the current situation, lead to cuts to public services might be needed, raising taxes might be needed. So there are some issues here. Wales is fairly dependent on the public sector. As a proportion, we have more people working in the public sector than other parts of the UK. For a healthy, balanced economy, you want to thrive in private sector, because that is going to contribute to the tax revenues that we then can spend on making the public sector work better. We spend a lot on the NHS here in Wales. We spend a lot on education. It might be prudent for Welsh Government with independence to look at different policies that could stimulate growth, stimulate competition, innovation, employment, enterprise, skills and training. All of these things are going to boost productivity and growth and make us sustainable in the long term. Initially, short term, might be turbulent, might be a little bit scary for some people, but with the right planning in place, it could make Wales a prosperous nation.
Mac, would you like to come in on that as well?
Yeah, so I'm not scared at all. I get the points. I think that when we go and, our delegation that rocks up to Westminster and they try and tell us that we've got to take part of their debt for the wars that they've fought, for the bad management they've made, for they treat us like a basket case country. Well, if we are, then give us a dowry to go away. I think this is a point of negotiation in terms of what we take the national debt. And the way I'd start the conversation is they owe us money rather than the other way around. This is a political conversation, not a fiscal conversation, and we need to treat it that way. And I think we need, this is about making sure that when we have a referendum on independence, we actually carry the weight of the country with us. 51% is inappropriate. I would like to see significant support for it so that, you don't get whoever's in Johnson's seat in, 10 years' time, whenever we go for it, I don't know, is somebody who they can say that they're negotiating with a population that believes in what it's doing and can see a route forward. So I think the political context is really important. I think when it comes to what we decide to spend our money on with regard to public services, I think that's a really interesting opportunity for us as well, but it starts to, again, this has nothing to do with currency now, but it starts us asking questions about things that matter. So what really matters? We've just heard 61% of children are living in poverty, are living below the minimum income standard in Wales. That is, I'm using language that is appropriate to this Zoom meeting, because the language I want to use for this would get bleeped all over the, this is wrong on an industrial scale. So these are the things that we can solve if we choose to in the country that we want to develop. And when you've got the currency, so we may not want to go and give £8 million to, I don't know, Amazon. So we helped to send one guy on a rocket ship that looked very phallic to the outer edge of space, and he thanked us. He should have just, I want to thank the Scottish government who gave him 13 million, Welsh government who gave him 8 million. These are the things we shouldn't do. There are other things we should do, and that becomes a political choice about what we do with our money. When you talk about, we all know that half of our money at the moment goes on the health service, but it's an illness service rather than a health service. We could change some of this narrative, and you can sense that there are politicians in the Senate today who want to change those things, and they are from all parties. So I think there are some real opportunities. That's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing, when it comes to, it's unstable today. The stability of the UK, we may have what's the biggest instability at the moment is that young people can't get houses, one of the things, young people can't get houses where they live. And part of that is driven by the way that the economy is set and the way that assets are being inflated by the activities of the Bank of England. I think this is it's a policy-driven conversation. It shouldn't be about the currency per se. And the last thing, I really, Tegid's point about Bank of England, I think it is the Bank of the UK. We should have a call on what that shared service does, and yet we have none. But neither does the north of England, neither does the southwest of England, neither does the Midlands. So within England, they also don't have a call on what the Bank of England does. The Bank of England does all its activity around a square mile of people whose sole role is extractive. So there's lots of things we can do. So I'm really not scared. I think we should look. This is a real opportunity for us to, to take things on and realize that we've got to tackle some really important issues.
That's really interesting, actually, because it brings us on to understanding how currency kind of feeds in through all these policy issues and all these different areas. And coming back to what several people have mentioned today already about adopting now, thinking about this now and getting on with doing that now. So how, if we were to do that, and if we were to get on with thinking about this now, how would any currencies that we develop here in Wales, be them cryptocurrencies or local currencies, however they work, how would they sit back side by side with the Bank of England? And would that be a relationship that would work for people on the ground, people in their communities? Who wants to go first on that?
I mean, I suppose, you're probably going to come up against some backlash from UK government if you start making a other form of tender for people to use. But if you tie it to the Welsh independence movement, I suppose maybe they wouldn't want to ruffle too many feathers and fan the flames. There's something just on the previous topic, something called skeuomorphic design, which is when you have ghosts in the design of something from a previous iteration. So a good example is when they first developed cars, they had leather reins, as they would with a horse, because they hadn't yet thought a steering wheel would make more sense. So when we think about a more efficient, socially scalable digital currency, one where, the technology exists and is being used now, and it's technology which I work on, which is you can have the read keys, so you can see exactly where funds move through a system. But then on the flip side of that, you can also not have those keys and have complete privacy. So citizens could have privacy in their expenditure, much like they would with notes or coinage. But public sector could have complete transparency in their spending, which I think would be, and it would be very accessible data as well, which I think would be huge for making public spending a lot more efficient, because that's a huge problem. When we talk about pulling back public sector, we often think about all the frontline workers who are the ones who usually get attacked. But if we can actually see where that money's going and an overinflated middle management and some poorly procured services from private companies, then some of those public sector cutbacks, which could save some money for Wales, don't equate to frontline services being attacked. Actually, they could equate to frontline services being strengthened. So that's something which we now have in the new design of this type of digital currency, and why it's far more efficient than the sort of legacy financial systems we have. And this is exactly why, central banks around the world, People's Bank of China, the European Central Bank, Fed, and the Bank of England are all investigating and developing digital currencies, which are more natively digital. So, of course, it makes sense that Wales does the exact same thing. And then ultimately we do it in a way which is controlled and regulated by the people of Wales as a public commons. And then, its monetary supply can be, if we want to tweak it, then we'll tweak it for social justice. Maybe we'll have a job guarantee program for the people of Newport to bring up employment. So when we think about a leaky, financial like money, like a British pound, we shouldn't then apply those same prejudgments to what we would then have as an independent Wales with a much more technically competent Cymru coin, or whatever you want to call it.
That's really interesting, isn't it? So we're not only thinking about how we can make this better, how we can make our money and our currency drive positive change in our community, but it's interesting to think about how do we make that happen without using the problems that we have now as a baseline? So how do we get rid of them altogether? So what institutions do we need for that? Should we be developing those institutions now? And how do we go about doing it as people on the ground? Me or my next door neighbour, what can they do to think about starting us on that journey of an independent sovereign currency, whatever it looks like? How can we do that now?
This is one of the very important concepts which have been around, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and those sorts of things for such a long time is this promise of what's called social scalability, which is where you have such huge efficiency savings, like that guy in El Salvador is able to pay his electricity bill without having to go to the office and blah blah blah. You're streamlining that payment. You're making like a huge efficiency and all that friction in payment which existed before. So actually, infrastructure wise, it's amazing how much we could do now on very little infrastructure. Just a bunch of people sitting down for a few weeks and developing something and seeing if people want to use it or not. Because after all, they can choose to use it or not use it. So I think for regular people, I would just say be aware of some of the other moves which other central banks are making on digital currencies and get informed on some technologies, like, maybe learn how to manage like a public key. So within all this world, we have public key cryptography, which is where you have a private key and a public key. And that's kind of the backbone to how I securely send, transfer value from me to you. It's a technology which we'll all become hyper aware of as, things like passwords and captures become too complicated for human beings, which will happen soon enough. But for now, it's a technology which people don't really use too much, and it's a core technology of some of these digital currencies. So inform yourself about public key cryptography. That's a good place to start.
So informing ourselves is a really good one, really, isn't it? And going out there and starting to get to grips with these terms and this terminology that I can see you're very comfortable with there, but I'm hearing it and it's
absolutely
almost,
yeah, it's technobabble. It's like when people first started speaking about the internet, and then people who weren't using the internet would be overwhelmed.
Yeah, exactly. And it is really easy to be overwhelmed. And I think one of the things we need to do in the independence movement is just bring ourselves back down to earth every now and then, and support each other in our learning, because we have so much to learn. But I'm wondering, things like I can see behind you there, Tegid, you've got the Banc Cambria and stuff behind you, and this is an institution that's going to be new for Wales. It's a bank for Wales. How does that move us towards independence, or does it? And what does it mean for us having that kind of institution?
We haven't had a proper bank with a current account facility in Wales, owned in Wales by people in Wales for about 150 years, really. Building societies allow you to take out a mortgage or to save money, but they don't allow you to have a current account, and they don't allow you to borrow money in less in smaller chunks as you would a car loan or something like that. So it's extremely important that we take a first step using a public bank, as we're setting up, myself and Mark Hooper and a group of others. It's an incredibly important step. It's not a central bank, it's a conventional bank. You go on, you'll have a debit card, and you'll have a mortgage, and you'll have a business debit card and things like that. But it is a big first step, because it brings home to Wales the ability to be able to run a bank. And as Justin said earlier, a lot of the money supply in the market is generated by banks. So, when you get a mortgage, that money is being created. It isn't coming, it isn't exchanged for gold. It's being created by the bank. It's just a line on a spreadsheet somewhere, type, on a database. So huge step. Now, I wanted to go back a little bit, because there was two things that were said that I want to talk about a bit more. One was whether Wales would have responsibility over its 5% of UK government debt. Now, during the Scottish independence referendum, the Bank of England and the UK Treasury had to clarify that if Scotland became independent, the Bank of England and the UK Treasury would be responsible for Scotland's portion of the debt. And then a negotiation would then have to take place. So I wouldn't say that Wales is entirely responsible for its proportion of the UK debt, because really the Bank of England and the UK Treasury stated very clearly that that Scotland wouldn't be responsible, and it'd have to be a negotiated thing. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, the relationship between the Bank of England and the UK Treasury during COVID has been completely transformed. So the UK government deficit, thanks to furlough and drop of activity and the fact that we've had the largest drop in GDP for over 600 years, has been made up by a period of quantitative easing by the Bank of England to the tune of roughly £370 billion and increasing. And what they've done is the UK Treasury has had to deal with the deficit by producing government debt, releasing government debt, and then the Bank of England has digitally created 370 billion, roughly 370 billion out of nothing, which is the quantitative easing bit, and bought that debt back. Now, the Bank of England is entirely owned by the UK Treasury. So basically it's been shuffling money from one institution to another. Yes. So now the Bank of England is owed interest payments from the UK Treasury, but that's completely circular because the UK Treasury entirely owns the Bank of England.
That's something
and what this means is if the NHS is only being offered a 3% pay rise, that is entirely fictional. Yes, it could be 10%, it could be 15%, because they've already broken the relationship between the Bank of England and the UK Treasury. There's no reason at all why the UK Treasury couldn't say, well, we need to reward the NHS, we're going to increase the NHS in England pay by 15%. There would be a net consequential on that, which would then go into the Welsh government's coffers, it would go into the Scottish government's coffers, and then the UK government could then generate via the Bank of England a load of money to pay for it. The outcome for this can be an increase in inflation, and we're not seeing a large increase in inflation. We're seeing a marginal increase in inflation, but that's a lot to do with COVID problems, transportation problems. We're 100,000 lorry drivers short. We've got lots of roll-on, roll-off problems at the ports instead of, lift-on, lift-off ferries. So we have to understand that currency is extremely important to via monetary policy to the way a country is run. And a lot of the decisions that have been made by the UK government over the last 40 years have been effectively fake, to be quite honest, fake. So we've needed 10 or 11 years of austerity for absolutely no reason at all. We were able to bail out all the banks in 2008, 2009 with quantitative easing to a similar amount, 350 billion. We just generated the 350 billion out of nothing, and we've been able to do the same thing again now. So there's absolutely no reason at all why NHS staff couldn't be paid more than they are now, and it's a disgrace, absolute flipping disgrace, that they're not being paid more. There's no reason not to. Anyway, I've said enough.
It's such an important point, isn't it? And it brings us back to this idea that being able to control how we create our money and where it goes is so central to understanding what kind of nation we want and where it's going, which in turn is important for independence, because it's something that we can do now that's going to strengthen our ability to be independent at the end of the day. And that it's difficult in this conversation, I'm sure, for a number of people to see clearly where we're going with that. Matt, do you want to come in? You're still on mute, Matt.
I've unmuted myself. I just want to bring it back to the political stuff as well, just briefly. And I think there's we know that this was a massive issue for Scotland, and I think that this movement needs to do some serious work on perhaps even mirroring what a Welsh currency would do. Now you could run computer software, modeling things and say, well, this is what would happen. This is how we'd use it. These are the risks that would come up. This is how we would deal with inflationary risk. We could add into that model issues of complexity. We could add into that model issues of vulnerability, and we could learn now, and we could start to give confidence to people that actually, if and when we do this, it works. And the other thing is we need to be really sharp now at dealing with the challenges we'll get when someone says, what happens if you're in Welshpool and you want to go to Oswestry and you want to buy a sandwich from Oswestry? We just need to say, well, you've got a debit card, mate. It's really easy. You ping one, you ping the other. You don't notice. At the moment, so who goes and gets euros when they go abroad anymore? They just take their debit card with them and they use that. It's we've got to simplify these silly debates that we'll have. And the other thing I think we can start to do on a political level is just start to talk about this as being normal, because I think that there's I think IndyRef was lost on this subject. So this is the thing that got those people who were a little bit wary, the indie curious, to fall back onto what they always knew. So if we want to build for this now, let's build the case. Let's build a product. Perhaps let's build a brand. Let's work out what this currency is going to be called, what the institution is going to be called. Things like that will build confidence. And then people can actually test it out and see whether or not it works. Because I don't want to be at a point where we're ready to stop 61% of children living in poverty, and it fails because we failed to do the work at the start to think this is how we go and do it. So it's critical we get onto this now.
From what you're saying there's 3 basic points there. So looking at developing stuff now to start building it now, and what we can do to do that. Mirroring it, so modeling so we can create learning, create confidence, and create a speciality, I suppose, an expertise in the nation that when this does happen, that we know what we're doing. And also that we start targeting the perceived complexity of these issues. So we start targeting that argument and saying this isn't complex for people on the ground, and it's quite easy, really. The complexity is behind the scenes, and this is stuff we've been learning through mirroring and developing maybe parallel currencies, local currencies. But we hear a lot about things like the Bristol pound. How does that come into it? We've got Celyn here in Wales, which is something similar, not quite the same, but something similar. How does that feed in? Could we develop something like that would work?
Yeah, Celyn's great, and it could certainly be interoperable with some sort of Welsh pound. But yeah, the Bristol pound experiment, that was pretty early on, and it was successful because people culturally identified with it, and people wanted to adopt it. And in fact, the sort of lack of attack they got from regulators is I suppose quite encouraging. But for me, to take out that potential point of failure, which would be if you have an institution, it could be attacked by UK government for issuing legal tender without their permission, would be to have it through an open source and have it kind of decentralized in a way which is censorship resistant enough that it would just be too hard for the UK government to take out. And then also, link it with the independence movement, of course. But yeah, and with not having a traditional central bank, you then take away, those levers of power, which can be grasped by, the super rich, which we've seen with other central banks. And you could start small. I mean, Yestival is probably a perfect environment to grow such a thing, because you could pick the 5 biggest Yes Cymru groups, give each one of those a private key, and then they could be the signatories on the federation to decide, whether more or less of these tokens should be produced or not. And then if people trust those 5 Yes Cymru signatories to make good decisions, then they'll use the currency. Local producers and buyers and sellers may use it. But giving people the experience of an actual native digital currency, you suddenly realize what's possible. That skeuomorphic design idea again. You suddenly realize how we've been dragging our feet for so long on quite legacy backward payment systems and networks like Visa. So getting it out there in the wild, absolutely. Find some use cases that people use and play around with the software and build services on top of it.
So I'm going to move us forward to think about, let's imagine that we're hopefully, in my head, I'm thinking maybe 7 years from now, when there's an IndyRef in a couple of months, and we're looking to build to that. We've called it. Yes, Cymru's called an indie ref. Welsh Government's seen that they can do nothing but follow that call, because there's a super majority in the Welsh nation of people who want to go for indie. What do we do now with currency? Where do we need to be at that point, 2 months before a referendum?
Before someone answers, I'm just going to say that I had shivers up my spine when you were saying that. So it shows that this could be imagine that day, but someone else can answer that question. Sorry, while I shiver.
Listen, do you want to have a go? Because we haven't heard from you in a little while. Where do you think we need to be at that point?
So for me, we're moving in the right direction with Banc Cambria. It's so important that we create and form our own financial institutions, not just banks. I'd like to see us exploring areas such as a Welsh pension fund, other areas, with the move towards cryptocurrency, that's offering opportunities to do with sort of data protection, ledgers, this sort of thing, which it is to do with the ecosystem which is required around a digital currency to make sure that it's all secure and protected. But I'd further go with the digital currency, that it offers an opportunity to design something which is totally unique, and it could be designed with particular focuses here in Wales. So this is a theoretical idea at the moment, but if we wanted to reduce poverty in Wales, we could have an indicator or an index related to Cymru coin or something else that you could call it. So as poverty fell, the value of the digital currency actually rose. But I would like to point out that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, although they do exhibit the attributes of currencies in some regards, other people, such as the Bank of England, they class them as crypto or digital assets. So they consider them closer to savings or bonds, different products. And this is because there's certain barriers to accessing digital currencies, the technology and the know-how to be doing it, that sort of thing. But for the future, we do have a unique opportunity here in Wales, because we do have a lot of the skills here that we could develop something, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be one. We could develop a range of crypto assets here in Wales. Like I said, you could have one which would be tied to reducing poverty. You could have another which would be tied to increasing renewable energy. It really is open to the users to design something that they see fit. So if we are looking ahead, I think now is the time where we can have a conversation about these things and we explore the opportunities. So yeah, that's it for now.
Mac, can you tell me, so we want to open the conversation now about designing these cryptocurrencies in a way that suits us. And we've talked there about poverty. We've talked about renewable energy, which I think is a really interesting point, because one thing we do have in Wales is a number of community investments, community companies developing community ownership in renewable energy. But do they go together? Does that make sense? Like thinking about cryptocurrency or a Welsh currency, and then thinking about investing in community ownership of things like renewable energy. Is there a relationship there?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think it can be a direct relationship as well, but it's also a relationship in the ownership model. So we could actually have, so Tegid discussed earlier and said the Bank of England is wholly owned by the UK government. You could actually have a central bank wholly owned by us cooperatively. So we all could have a say. It could be, we could democratize our central bank. So it's not just in how it invests and how it works and those sort of things. It's actually how it runs. How do we learn? Because we've adopted. I love Ben's consideration of the reins that they used to put in cars to start off with. We should be really careful that we don't take any of those bad things into what we're doing. And the fact that Wales today doesn't have an influence over what the Bank of England does and the City of London does. In our new independent Wales, what I would hate is if Cardiff had so basically there was this, we transferred that bad learning into what we deliver. So democratizing this thing and the ownership of it would be the sort of thing that we should do. And it becomes perhaps an automatic right on citizenship. And, and citizenship becomes something that you own that central bank, and it doesn't have big influences, and the big companies will have as small an influence as you and I would, but it's an equal influence. That's the sort of thing I think would be. So I'm answering your question indirectly, I think, but I think there's stuff that we could learn which would be hugely, which will be a huge learning, and I think we then share that to others as well. There was in one of the previous, we talked about Wales being world leading. I'm not a fan of suggesting we're going to lead the world on things, but there are some things that I'd love us to try, and we can be, at the forefront of innovation on this sort of thing.
So, to give you an example of a central bank that isn't owned by central government, Swiss central bank, for instance, is 70-odd% owned by the cantons, cantonal banks, and public institutions, and then the rest of it is floated on the Swiss stock exchange. So it doesn't have to be owned by a Welsh treasury or central government at all. It could be owned by the local authorities. It could be owned as a mutual, so it could have 3.2 million owners, couldn't it? There's no reason why not. We could all be members of a central bank. If you can float it on the Swiss stock exchange and you and I can buy shares in the Swiss central bank, there's no reason why the whole population of Wales couldn't have ownership of it. So there's lots of different models to look at here, I think. And a mutual central bank, which is something myself and Mr. Mark over here, we've spoken about this before, it seems quite attractive to me.
I think that's really exciting as well, especially when you pair up the idea of having a mutually owned bank by every person who's a citizen of Wales, and you pair that up with the idea of creating a currency that is purposeful to and linked to poverty and local matters and that kind of thing. I think that's truly an exciting idea, and it's something that we should be pushing for every single day and developing. It's really exciting to me, and it's interesting to hear about the Swiss ideas as well. But what else is happening around the world? What examples do we have that are comparable to where we are in Wales?
Well, technologically wise, it's more for a private market scenario. But so Bitcoin has the ability to have these things called side chains, and quite a famous one is one called the Liquid Network. And that is federated amongst a bunch of financial institutions and exchanges. So each one of them has a say or a vote, and there's like 20 or 30 of them, and they collectively validate the transactions, which are passed through their blockchain, and then also they decide whether they want to issue a token, and if they can inflate or deflate the supply of these tokens. So we actually have like a running example that's all free and open source code as well. So we actually have a free and open source example which you could really take and just change and use it for Wales if you wanted to. I think probably we want something a little bit more bespoke, but the idea of local authorities being, instead of these exchanges and financial institutions, you hand that power to the local authorities. And if Wrexham and Cardiff want a motorway between each other and Paris don't want that, then Wrexham and Cardiff needs to get some consensus of 20 local authorities in Wales to make that money available. So it's really how you find consensus, which is one of the biggest bugs in one of the hardest things to achieve. And I think to have everyone in Wales each have a vote on consensus, that's incredibly difficult to do. And you'd end up with kind of a mixed match of consensus algorithms like you have in Bitcoin. You'd end up with mining, and it could create a lot of carbon emissions. But if you have each one of these local authorities with a vote, and then these local authorities are put in power by the people who live in that local authority politically, then they will act within the interests of the citizens as a whole of Wales. So I think that practically federation is probably the best way to go. And actually there's already a real world example of that exact system, and it's transferring billions and billions of pounds worth of liquidity every day. So it's very much something which Wales could use.
That's really exciting. One of the things that worries me, before we move on to questions from everybody else, because I can see there's a few questions there and it's important that we can have a think about those as well. But before we do that, the only thing that worries me about cryptocurrency is infrastructure, internet quality, accessibility to technology. How does that fit in?
So if you think that countries are moving away from coins and notes anyway to digital payments, we can replicate much of the legacy financial system. So we can create a debit card, which acts like a debit card at a point of sale. We can create all of these things. What's great about, so going back to that sidechain, the Liquid network, the protocol I work on, which is the Lightning network, which is these super fast microtransactions, which opens up a whole world of possibilities. That's directly interoperable, transferable. So you can literally put that protocol on top. So if you made a Cymru coin on something like Liquid Network on a sidechain, you could then apply the Lightning Network on top of that protocol. And you could, all the software we work on is free and open source, and it's millions of hours of very qualified people's work has gone into it. You can just fork those and you can just adapt them for Cymru coin. And instantly overnight, you have, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of different software solutions. Access to these payment rails and payment networks, which are on the cutting edge of payment technology, open up a whole world of possibilities for the Welsh economy. Sorry, you're muted.
You see, I did warn everybody about this, so nobody can complain. Yeah, so the idea that I'm building in my head now is that we can have a central bank in Wales that's owned by the citizens of Wales, controlled through federalisation, I can't say that, so that it's not overly complicated, and that operationally on the ground, people wouldn't necessarily have to learn any new skills, and people wouldn't necessarily see any change because we can use debit cards in exactly the same way. So to me, that's actually bringing something that seems vastly complicated right down to the fact that for my 9, for example, she's going to get her debit card out of her bag and she's going to put it in the machine and get her cash out and pay the milkman in exactly the same way as she would every other week. So, to me, that's really exciting if we can make it work like that, because it means that we can use really exciting stuff in a way that helps us as a nation, but also in a way that doesn't cut out a massive chunk of the population who can't access the information that we're giving to them right now. So I'm really excited by that, actually. I'm going to go to questions. We've got a few questions here.
Elin, can I just quickly?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, go for it.
Just say, I think we've got to be prepared for is big corporate companies telling us how stupid we are, how incapable we are of running our own currency in this way, and how wrong it is. So part of the belief in this, as well as making sure that your nan believes in it. We can't have it. It's so important that this goes through the communities. The point that Russell made earlier about getting closer to communities with conversations like this is critical, because the only way we'll all stand up against these, Tesco saying we're not going to come to Wales if you don't have, sterling or whatever it may be. We need us as a community to be strong in this as well. So I just, the evil big guys won't like it.
I think it's interesting, and it's an important point, because from what I know of the Bristol Pound, one of the things that meant that it was able to be a success was that the local authority took it on as a way of paying their employees. So I think that's probably, part of the detail maybe, but it's something that we really need to consider. Who are our partners in this? Who do we bring along that's going to make this a success for us? Does anybody want to jump in on any of those points that we've risen there before we go to questions from the audience?
I'll just say one thing. Tesco was actually quite happy to use the Irish pint for a number of decades. It set itself up in Ireland in the mid-60s, and it was quite happy with the Irish pint. So there's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't be happy with the Welsh pint either. Anyway, we should all be using cooperatives anyway.
Anybody else? No, I'm going to go to questions then because we've got a few here. Okay. So there's a question here from Mandy, and she's asking basically what conversation is going on in Scotland about currency. So we often do look to Scotland for our independence movement and comparisons. So do we know what's going on there?
So the only thing I know is that Danny Blanchflower, who's a famous economist and former member of the MPC, and he's based in America, but he actually grew up in Cardiff, actually. He's running a project at the moment, research project, to look at what Scottish currency an independent Scotland should use. So he's doing quite a big piece on that. And I asked him, so would this be applicable to Wales? And he said, yeah, of course it would. So he's already doing a lot of groundwork on this now. When I say the MPC, he was a member of the monetary policy group in the Bank of England for a number of years, particularly just up to the very, very turbulent time of 2007, 2008 banking crisis. And he called it, actually. So he's one of the few people who did. So yeah, I think keeping an eye on what he's doing would be a very good thing to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting and really good to know as well. Amanda asks as well, can a local currency or a digital currency run side by side? And we've talked about that a little bit. She's thinking about trade, import, export, cross-border travel, because these are worries, genuine worries that people have about employment and business and that kind of thing. Can they run side by side to make that easier? And would it make it easier, actually?
So people trade between currencies today. It's not as difficult as it's made out. It can be made a lot easier. I think the issue is that we've got to show the solutions now, not when we're in the middle of a referendum. That as simple as that. The negatives are going to be there, and they're going to be very loud, and we need to have done our work.
Yeah.
Good question.
We need to be ready, I guess. So Harriet's got a question. What will happen if in an Indie Wales people want to rejoin the EU? Would we have to adopt the euro, or should we adopt the euro?
I have a view. Denmark doesn't use the euro, although the European Union has said that any new members should use the euro. Not everybody does now. The UK didn't, so I would imagine that would be a negotiating point. If membership of the European Union is not available to us, then membership of EFTA or the European Economic Area would be a subset of that, so that we'd be able to trade with the European Union and other EFTA members. So. But I think that was probably negotiable, actually, given that there are countries within the European Union now that don't use the euro.
Okay, yeah.
There are also countries that are not members of the European Union that do use the euro. Like Monaco.
Why would they choose to do that?
Well, Monaco does, for instance. So that there are countries within in Europe that are non-members of the European Union that use the euro.
Could you do something like, could you start adopting, I don't know, I don't think this is a good idea, but it's an interesting question whether where you could actually adopt the euro and start using that more in Wales before we become independent, or is that just like an unnecessary complication?
Well, I mean, we purchase an awful lot of our goods from the European Union, particularly food, and so that might be a consideration. Yeah, I don't know. Electronics companies tend to purchase nearly everything in dollars, for instance. So when they're purchasing parts for manufactured electronics, they just do everything in dollars, no matter where they are in the world. So Sony Pencoy does an awful lot in dollars. So,
Mac, do you want to?
Yeah, let's flick back to Duncan's presentation earlier, where he talked about most of the food that gets produced in Wales gets carted off and eaten elsewhere. Most of the food we cart into Wales is produced elsewhere and we cart it in. So some of these things, this is why this isn't a debate in isolation. This needs to be debate in the full as well. So I think that, let's treat this as a whole Wales and internationally focused issue, I think, in the main. On a personal level, I didn't want to leave the EU. I was once a fan of the euro. I think it'd be quite dangerous now if we, not dissimilar to Greece, Portugal, the Southern Ireland, Ireland, when they had their problems, and basically somebody else from somewhere else told them what they had to do. And we've had enough of that, haven't we? I don't want somebody else from somewhere else telling me what to do anymore.
Yep.
Yeah, I love the euro, and countries which have a shared currency historically very rarely go to war with each other. And we all know Europe's ability to go to war in on itself. So adopting the euro does have that benefit to it. But then, having your own sovereign soft currency, and using it properly can be very, very powerful. Again, I refer everyone to look at the work of the modern monetary theorists on some of the fiscal stimulation and benefits you can have from actually using a soft currency and really pushing its functions as far as they will go. And it could provide a lot of the social justice Wales needs, and the job offers and opportunities, and a stronger public sector. So yeah, it's great. It would be, I think, ideal for Wales to have its own sovereign currency, which it controls, but have it very interoperable with the euro. And as the ECB develops their digital currency, then hopefully that can be done in a very seamless, frictionless way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's so many different, we tend to think that there's black and white, but there's actually so many different ways of making this work, and so many different examples across the world and what we want to do. It's having that idea of what we want to do as an independent nation, and what we want to change, and the kind of society that we want to build, that actually drives this idea of what kind of currency is going to suit us, I think. So Matt Doc asks us, but what if the economic climate is much more adverse than it is currently? Do you think that it would make people more or less comfortable with a different currency?
That's another good argument for Wales having its own currency. If you look at the Greek financial crisis and how little control they had as being part of the euro.
Yep. And that shows how Iceland having its own currency. So Iceland have its own currency and had similar huge challenges during the banking crisis, was able to get itself out of trouble because it had control over its own currency. There's a huge, countries that had lots of difficulties during the global financial crisis in Europe were Ireland, Greece, the UK, and Iceland, other countries as well. But those with sovereign currencies were able to do things quickly. Now, quantitative easing was something that was able to be done by the UK government, but quantitative easing was done by Iceland as well. And as I said earlier, Iceland has a population of 450,000 people. So the size is not an issue. The size of the country, the size of the population is not a limiting factor at all.
Which is good to know, isn't it? Because it kind of spells a lot of the things that are thrown at us about our size and that kind of thing. So Mike's asking, if we started to spend on the Welsh pound better, e.g. targeting...
I just briefly add some...
Yes, of course, yes, please do. Justin, are you still with us?
So yeah, with Iceland, they actually had their financial collapse earlier than we did. So in 2005, the banks in Iceland.
We're having a few troubles hearing you, Justin. I don't know if you want to start your.
Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry.
Do you want to just start your comments again, Justin, so we can hear it?
Than we did. And this actually led to the pots and pans revolution.
Justin, I'm going to stop you there because I don't.
Iceland, where the people stood outside the Icelandic Parliament and they made a lot of noise. And this actually led to the reforms and the democratization. Oh, I'm not sure why. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, it's better now, yes.
Yes. Collapse earlier than we did. So in 2005, the banks in Iceland, they were over leveraged and they were in big trouble.
I think we've actually lost Justin there, but I think the what he was trying to explain was the importance of Iceland having an independent sovereign currency, the effect this had on them, feeling the impact of the 2008 crash, 2007-2008 crash 2 years earlier, and the ability the population had there to make the changes to democratize their banking system.
Can I just, the other thing about Iceland at the time, they also did a lot of bad things from a banking. So I think what Justin was saying is that they invested in weird and wonderful stuff. You know, had loads of councils in England in particular who had their money in Iceland because they were offering them better rates of return and things.
Yeah.
And a similar thing happened. You could argue, you know, would the Scottish economy have coped with NatWest Group as it is now, which was supposedly based in Scotland, collapsing? And I'm not sure they would have. And a lot of that is because of the casino banking thing. So, you know, Justin mentioned earlier about making sure we do things in a very balanced way, and I think that's part of. Yeah, I don't want casino banks in Wales. Thanks very much.
Yeah, completely. Yes. So I'm going to go on now to. I'm just scrolling through to see where we are. Stefan, Justin, can you hear us, Justin? And how's your connection? I have a question specifically for you here. Okay, I'm going to come back to that one then. Phil Thomas asks a question.
I can't. Sorry about my technical difficulties there. Yeah, great.
I'm going to leave it a little bit, Justin, because I'm not able to hear you very well. So the minute we've got a stable connection there, we'll come back to that one. But Phil Thomas asks, where is Banc Cambria in terms of gestation?
Thanks, Phil. It's something, a lot of it's largely out of direct control in that this is, we're working with the regulators at the moment. So you may have seen, we're working with an existing partner, existing financial institution. So we're in a strong place. You know, I wanted it launched 3.5 years ago. Whenever I the day after I started working on it. So it takes time. We are, I think, going to be the first community bank in the United Kingdom. So it just shows that I think we'll be as quick as we can be. The good thing is, though, the regulator is making sure that the whole thing is safe, which is the first priority of any bank, is to make sure it's safe. But so soon, I just replied on Twitter, actually, soonish. Will that do still? We're working hard.
So Mandy suggests that every child born in Wales should automatically open a Bank of Wales account with 100 pence of Welsh pounds. So that's a really nice idea to have there. Christopher's asking us what's stopping Welsh Government creating a parallel currency right now?
Just, well, I suppose it's whether they feel brave enough to do it or not. There's nothing stopping them from doing it now.
No.
Would we benefit from them taking that action?
Yes. I do think that something organic and grassroots, kind of like the Bristol Pound. I mean, you know, I think all of us here appreciate, you know, bottom-up action, direct action, and I do feel that if Wales were to have its own digital currency, that it would be best built in that way, because then you find the actual use cases, like what do people want to use it for, and then you're able to, you know, work on those use cases and develop the the currency for that. So yeah, getting it out in the wild, but then also just having it from the grassroots bottom up as opposed to top down, I think is probably important, because ultimately, if you have government do anything, then generally they have the hand on the lever of power, and it might be best for them not to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to ask a quick question now, which is, how do we use this idea of an independent currency to convince people who don't want an independent Wales that it's a good idea?
Just use it as a sorry to put in again, but you could just use it for its technology, and you could just pitch it as, okay, we've got this new thing which we can use. It's a cultural medium of, it has a kind of cultural association. It's a medium of exchange, and we can use it to build these new services on. It's kind of digitally native, and you can do things which your legacy fiat can't do. And then maybe it will pull people in, who don't want an independent Wales. Maybe they'll think, well, okay, this sovereign currency does kind of work, and perhaps we could use this full time as our own currency, and it could be enough, give us enough power and independence away from someone else's currency that maybe independence is a good idea. So yeah, it could be a tool of liberation and to encourage others to want to become independent, I think.
Can I have a go as well? I think we've already spent a lot of our energy talking about the things that need to change in Wales. So independence needs to mean something. We need to change people's lives. We need to make things better. We need to stop that 61%. These are the way that you get other people to join this campaign and start to build this movement. We need to prove that this is part of the toolkit we need to improve people's lives. And the people's lives I think we need to improve the most are those people whose voices aren't being heard in this at the moment. And they are out there, and they've given up. They actually don't think that anyone really cares sufficiently to solve their problems. And I think we need to, and going back, Russell's point earlier in the day, how do you build this movement? We need to get out there and start to have this conversation. I think it's a currency then. It isn't about independence they're voting. They're voting for change for their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. We can build that legacy, and that's what we need to do.
Thank you, Mark. We've come to the end of our time, and this conversation has been a whirlwind, but really informative, really exciting. And I think what it's shown us all is that there is space for us to build something that's going to have a massive impact, positive impact on our lives, and that the control of that is in our hands, which is just independence there in a nutshell, isn't it? Let's get on and do this and find a way to make people's lives better. So thank you everyone for coming and chatting, and I hope everyone found the conversation useful. I think Kian is going to jump in now and summarise for us if he's there. So I'm looking forward to that, actually.
Really? Well, my head is about to explode. I think Elin has summed up a lot of it quite eloquently as we've gone through the conversation, to be honest. So with a little bit of luck and an awful lot of skill, I'll get us to the end of this summary in one piece. I think it's obvious there's so many options available, and there's no way we can wait for a referendum to start this conversation, which is mainly a big factor of why Yestival exists. So these conversations take time, and yeah. So I think it's encouraging when we hear stories of Iceland that size doesn't matter. The work that needs to start now. What resources we've got, supporting groups, addressing day-to-day concerns. I like that someone mentioned that we can't afford not to be independent, or so I'm going through my notes here. I agree with the idea that there's no point to independence if we're just going to recreate the same system or the same mistakes if we don't learn from history and recreate the model that the UK, current model in the UK and the City of London it's not sustainable. I think it's been mentioned already, and that's not what drives most, well, I'm going to guess, drive most of the independence movement community and beyond. There's a wealth of opportunity that this scenario gives us and needs to be explored. Like the idea of transparency and the privacy, a technically competent system is a positive message we can pursue. I'd like to see a resource-based of what we've learned today across all three panels, put on the Yes Cymru website as part of the educating ourselves. I found it interesting, the UK Treasury, Bank of England, the relationship they have, to me anyway, is strikingly why we need some physical independence. The fact that we could give the nurses a pay rise, especially in light of a 1% rise for nurses, whilst we can find 44% rise for weapons of mass destruction. These are ideological choices. I agree that currency was decisive in the Scottish Indy referendum. Again, we can't wait for a referendum to have these conversations. Work can start now, from what I gather, in establishing institutions, the cooperatives. I like the idea of democratising the central banks. Yeah, these things, there's concerns there we need to address. They take time, but it's not impossible. It's going to be difficult, but anything worth achieving is going to be hard work. I think education basically is key. It's important, especially when we consider possible pushbacks from establishment and those who don't like the status quo because it suits them. Self-belief we have to nurture, we have to counteract generations of being led that we aren't able. So we need to understand the risks, and my last note was homework is key. So and together we can help each other and gain a greater understanding. Now then, if that wasn't a minefield, maybe Caris can help me out summarise my own summing up, if she's around. If not, and I'm talking to myself,
I'm just going to let you carry on. That was excellent, carry on.
It is difficult to navigate, and but I'm just happy that everyone who's agreed to take part today did so. So informative, so important piece of the jigsaw that we start this work now, these conversations, and hopefully it'll be a foundation for us to push on now, not just beyond here, but in pubs, in the communities, on the streets and online, in a positive and respectful manner. So
Matt, there's a poll now as well. It's come up on everybody's screens. So if everybody would like to submit what they would think a priority to end poverty in Wales. What is your priority to end poverty in Wales? Independence, Welsh Government to create a policy to tackle poverty, more powers devolved to the Senedd, rolling out UBI. So if you could all, have you got it up on your screen, Kian? Yeah, give it a whirl.
I just, as well, I'd like to say just a word of thanks to everyone who's helped organise today. It takes a lot of hard work and work from volunteers, especially. so a massive thank you. Diolch o galon.
Yeah, mae wedi bod yn anhygoel heddi. Mae gen ni cwpl o fideos. There's a few videos for us to watch after the pause. It should be about 3 minutes. Hang on, we have 2 more minutes to vote, everyone. So that would be great. All of the panelists today, it's been so fruitful. And like I said, this is one of the reasons I joined Desk Cymru in the first place, to just further understand all of these details. Yes, so let's have a look. It's nearly coming up. So yeah, if we go through all the panelists, so we had Sarah, well, thank you so much for Sarah Rees, our interim chair, Elin Hywel, Hilary Wainwright, Russell Todd, Shavana Taj, Donald Whalen, Duncan Fisher, Katie Garrity-Swan, Rajsri Sai Krishnan, I hope I said that okay, Sam Ward, Kian, of course, marvellous, Mark Hooper, Tegid Roberts, Justin Peter-Lilly, and Ben Ark. So it's just been fantastic. And also, we'll be watching a video now, but afterwards, if you'd like to join us in an actual networking session, that would be marvellous. The link is on our Eventbrite, so it's probably in our emails that you've been sent out. Also, wrth gwrs, yn y chat box ych chi'n gweld fyna, allwch chi siarad fyna, chi'n gallu siarad, ie, mae'n gweud fyna, yn y chat box yna, chi'n gallu siarad eich gilydd. A hefyd, allwn ni rwydweithio mewn ffordd mwy hwylus. Mae DJ set wedi cael ei baratoi i gyd. A dyma ni, dyma'r poll results ar y gair. So, dyma chi, what is your priority to end poverty in Wales? 50% say independence. 4% Welsh Government to create a policy to tackle poverty, 17% more powers devolved to the Senedd, and 29% rolling out UBI. Do you want to comment on that, Kian?
It's true. Yeah, I think what's been clear, there is no right, wrong. Well, there is right and there is wrong. No, there's no black and white, is what I'm trying to say. Many aspects, many possibilities, but certainly I wouldn't rely on Welsh Gov as it currently is, or the establishment in Westminster to tackle poverty or climate crisis. Hence, or we wouldn't be here to begin with.